In this video, I'm going to share some thoughts about a particular approach to teaching that many institutions have adopted as their default response to COVID-19, and that we know some of you are at least considering adopting for your blended traditional courses or your blended with an online pathway courses. It's an approach that we call simulcasting, but because many people have been using a lot of different terms to mean a lot of different things, we thought it would be useful to talk a bit about what we in the CAT mean when we use the term simulcasting. So when I say simulcasting, what I mean is an approach where you are essentially teaching the course as you normally would in person, but to a smaller group of students. Then the rest of the students who are not able to be in the classroom, whether because of social distancing or other reasons why they must take the course remotely, would then participate in the course by watching or engaging via Zoom a live stream of what's happening in the classroom that is recorded by a camera or some other recording device. Now, you may have heard this referred to as high flex in the literature and the higher ed press literature. I know that the Chronicle of Higher Education often calls it hybrid. Some people on campus have referred to this as blended. But one of the things we want you to know is that these three terms actually have very technical meanings in the higher education literature and the literature on online education. And so when we use these terms, we actually mean something very different by them than simulcasting. What we have described here actually does have a technical name in the literature, but it's one we've chosen not to use because we think it would be too confusing. And here's what that technical name is. This approach is technically called a blended synchronous approach. And the reason it's called blended synchronous is that it is blended in the sense that it is both face-to-face teaching and online teaching. But what makes it different from a traditional blended approach is that that face-to-face and online teaching happens at the same time. And that's why it's also called blended synchronous. Because we're using synchronous to talk about strategies in fully online courses and blended to talk about a variety of other things, we just thought this would be way too confusing. And so we are using the term simulcasting, or if you prefer, streaming, to talk about this kind of approach to teaching. Now, if you watched our last video, you know that the institution made decisions about our academic plan in accordance with three broad principles that were most important to us. These are also principles that the CAT cares quite a bit about, and we are particularly interested in thinking about this middle one, which is faculty choice. And that's particularly important to highlight in this video because you're going to see that we're going to have some recommendations that suggest that this approach really is not one that we would recommend for most of us. But we want to emphasize that ultimately the CAT doesn't tell you how to teach. We just provide the evidence and share our recommendations, and it's ultimately up to you to interpret that and make the choice for yourself. And you know best your students and your teaching and what will work well for you. But we hope that you will at least follow along and think through some of the questions we raise before you make a choice about how you are going to proceed. So as I said, we in the CAT think that simulcasting has some challenges. In particular, we think that some of the challenges are in conflict with all three of the principles that we care about. And so we want to run through some of those challenges with you today. So this will be a bit of a longer video. So I hope you'll stick through to the end. So let's start with student learning and what we know about the evidence. To the surprise of many, it turns out that online education actually has piles and piles of research that has been done that show that if it's done well and done in a certain way, student learning actually can be comparable to face-to-face learning in an online course. Also, a lot of research has been done on traditional blended courses. And again, we'll say more about what that is in future videos. But what I found most interesting about this research, this line of research, is that it actually seems as if the blended courses actually do more for our students than even our face-to-face courses. So this is really exciting for us to think through how to teach blended courses, as it might be something we can take back once things are back to pre-COVID times and to be able to think through how to design our courses that incorporate more blended elements. So what about simulcasting? Well, turns out there's a lot less research on simulcasting. Not much has been done. There's been some stories and narratives. There's been some theory on simulcasting, but not a lot of good empirical work comparing simulcasting outcomes to face-to-face or online outcomes. What little has been done is pretty mixed. The negative research suggests that that simulcasting is not ideal for the students who are remote, that often the students who are remote get left out and get a sort of second-rate experience. And those studies that show that it can be comparable typically show that in order for it to be comparable, an institution needs to devote a great deal of resources to this approach, to training faculty, to learning technology, and also to having extra people in the room to manage both groups in terms of their engagement with the class. And so what we see is that it's really hard to do, and if you don't do it, put in the effort, it can actually be worse for our students. Another thing we really want to highlight is that all of that research on simulcasting was of a simulcast of, perhaps a great face-to-face experience and what is, typically business as usual. Except things won't be business as usual in this semester. And what you're going to be simulcasting, what you're going to be streaming to your remote students is not going to be your best face-to-face moments, but actually a socially distanced classroom where you're in a mask, students are in a mask, and you're 6 feet apart. So we think about this, let's think about this in terms of a discussion-based class. Now, this is actually an image from the University of Notre Dame, who is, they are adopting this approach, and so they've done a really good job of explaining it and also doing demos and showing videos to their faculty of the steps of how this would work. So I just want to bring these up so that we can compare them to some alternatives that you might choose for your courses from doing this sort of streaming. So what you see here is the professor at the front of the room. The camera is at the back of the room. The professor is in a mask, so it's hard to see the professor, but also probably hard to hear them. Notre Dame has done a good job of putting mics around the room to make it happen, but it's not, the best ideal experience to hear a lecture or to hear a discussion when folks are in masks. The students, not many of them, they will be where the blue spots are here. I think there'll be more students in this environment, but you only see the back of their heads. Again, there are going to be drop mics so you can hear them, but you won't really know who is speaking and who is not, which is a real challenge. And then, if the remote students want to participate in the class, the professor must go over and check on the chat or make sure to incorporate those students as equals in the class discussion, which is a particular challenge for the instructor, but also not great for the face-to-face students in that the professor might be distracted by trying to make sure that they were integrating those online students into the course. Now compare this to a Zoom discussion. There are a lot of things you can do online, but let's just go ahead and think about a Zoom discussion where students all see each other. They aren't wearing masks. They can hear each other. The professor can focus on all students at once at the same time to engage in that discussion. This seems, at least to me and to us in the CAT, to be a better way to hold a class discussion than to have half the class in person and half the class remotely Zooming in. Now, you might be thinking, okay, I get it. If you're having an interactive class discussion, definitely shouldn't be using simulcasting. But in my course, I lecture more often than I have discussions, and maybe the days that I lecture are the days that make sense for me to simulcast. As it turns out, Notre Dame also shows us what it looks like to simulcast a lecture. And so here's an image of what you would see. So great, the slides are screen shared via Zoom from the in-class so the students can see the slides pretty well. But look how small the image of the instructor video is. Since this is a video of the class simulcasted, you really want to see the board, but then the instructor is really tiny and they have their mask on and really, really hard to see that board, especially when you start adding in other squares of other students. Now compare this to a pre-recorded lecture where faculty is lecturing without a mask on, close to the monitor so you can see their facial expressions, where they can put their slides next to their face at the appropriate size, and where students can fast forward and rewind if they need to hear things again. How much better would this be for our remote students than it would be to watch a simulcasted streamed lecture from an in-person socially distanced class? So the thing I want you to take away from this, that we want you to take away from this, is that really we think that the simulcasting model is a model that really privileges our in-person students and the in-person teaching over our remote students and what they experience. On this model, the remote students are getting the short end of the stick on multiple fronts. First of all, they're not able to see things and hear things as well as they would if these things were designed for them. But second of all, we also know that the best way to do online education is not to just have students on Zoom all the time, that there are lots of other activities we can incorporate to help advance our students' learning besides just having them watch lectures or streaming discussions. And so what we would argue is that you should actually design for the remote students first and make sure their experience is really good. And if their experience is really good, you can worry about what you do in person after you've designed for your remote students. And this is particularly important because half of our students, particularly in a blended course, are going to be half of their time. No, all of our students will be spending half of their time in a remote learning experience. And we want to make sure that half of their time is high quality learning. And a lot of our students will not be able to come back to campus. And it's a serious equity issue if they are getting really poor second-rate remote learning experiences because of this model. So it's really important that we think about those remote students first if we're going to adopt this model. So that's not the only challenge. So student learning and student experience isn't the only challenge. We also think that this is a challenge for faculty as well, and particularly with respect to your workload. And that's true in two ways. So first, I want to highlight there was a story in the Chronicle of Higher Education about this where Derek Bruff was interviewed, who is the director of the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt, where they are also adopting this approach. And he went into the classroom and demoed it just like Notre Dame did and tried it out. And what he said is that his biggest takeaway was that almost everything an instructor needs to do in this environment is going to take a lot more time and a lot more mental effort. It's a new workflow, and even the simplest activities of calling on a student is a lot more complex. And he's a guy who wrote a book about technology and education. And so he admits that he's pretty advanced. But those of you that maybe struggle with technology or you aren't really sure, I think sometimes we think that this will be easier because you don't have to change as much as what you typically do, but it'll actually be harder and that you have to manage a lot more technology to make it work well. But in addition to it just being hard to manage in the moment, it's also the case that we think that this approach is going to make you ill-prepared for the unknown and for the pivot. So if you've prepared your courses to be in person and to be streamed to your remote students, what happens when your in-person students all of a sudden have to go online? And this is going to happen at the end of the semester, but it might happen in the middle of the semester as well, whether because they're quarantined or we send all students home. Now, you could just stay in your classroom and lecture to all of them remotely, but that's something that our students didn't particularly appreciate in the spring. Or you could suddenly realize, well, now I'm going to have to design a fully online course with activities and engagement that is different than just streaming my lecture. But then you're only going to have a weekend to do that, which we also know was not ideal in the spring. So for your sake, it's best to prepare really good quality experiences for your remote cohorts so that if this happens, you are totally ready to have all the students shift to all the remote plans that you had in place for each cohort. In addition to the issues for you, we also think that this is a challenge for the institution in terms of finances. So again, another story in the Chronicle of Higher Education that highlighted Northeastern's model, where they spent multiple millions of dollars to put these cameras into classrooms, was a real eye-opener, I think, for some of us, that our institution decided, well, that would be multiple millions of dollars. What else could we spend that money on? And particularly, we talked a lot about how we would prefer to spend that money to give back to our faculty who are going to be putting forth extra effort this summer to design really high quality remote experiences for their students to be prepared for a pivot. And so we made the choice that we'd rather spend that money on a peer-to-peer program than on a bunch of technology that would work somewhat maybe, but that would be really challenging, that we don't know is supported by the research, and that probably wouldn't be used after that. Now, I promise I did not plant her, but one of our peer facilitators, Marina in communications, has shared a quote with one of the stories about the peer-to-peer learning program that the CER has written that I think captures this decision quite well. And Marina says that this is absolutely the right way to do it. By training all of us to be better online teachers, it has by extension made me a better instructor overall. Our entire faculty body will benefit from this because it has a long-term impact that simply putting cameras in classrooms just doesn't. So we thought that the spending and investing in you all and your learning would be a better investment than investing in this kind of technology. So you may have decided at this point that, okay, fine, I think I'm pretty good with technology. I think I can make this work. I want to make a go for it, and that's great. But if you're now thinking, well, I'm not really so sure that I want to do this anymore, but I don't know what else to do, don't worry, we've got you covered. There'll be future videos on what we recommend for those of you who are teaching blended, traditional or blended with an online pathway courses.